Oh, got it.
This webinar has started. This webinar is being recorded. Welcome, people who are joining us.
Hello, hello.
I will maybe not ever understand how it works, that how quickly people from the waiting room get filtered in. It's a bit of a mystery to me.
Mm.
But people are definitely coming in, so that's great.
Huzzah!
Ah! All right. Welcome, folks who are coming in. Uh, we will do official introductions in a moment, but I will just give you some basic lay of the land info as you're joining us. To let you know that we do have chat activated, and you should have the opportunity to chat either to the host and panelists or just to or to everyone. You should be able to change in that blue box the pull down menu from everyone or host and panelists. If you want to make a comment or ask a question, you are welcome to do that in the chat, or you are welcome to use the Q&A function, and I'll be watching both of those. And we are recording for folks to watch later if you have to leave early, or if you have any technical difficulties. All that said, I think we'll officially get started. So, welcome to a Borderless series event with the University of Iowa Theater Arts Department. I am Jen Shook. I'm a assistant professor of theater history and dramatic literature and American studies here at the University of Iowa. I use she, her, and hers pronouns. And I will give you a visual description of myself for accessibility purposes. I have shoulder length, somewhat chaotic brown and gray hair, and I'm wearing cat eye glasses, very bright lipstick, and necktie, red and white floral print shirt. I'm sitting in a big armchair in front of a white wall and green curtain behind me, and there may be a cat joining us at some point. She's off screen and indecisive, so if you see me fall over, that is what that is about. I also want to thank the Missy Multicultural International and Student Support and Engagement Centers who have been partnering with us with UI Borderless throughout the semester. And I'll drop their link in the chat, as well as a link to the previous Borderless events, which were recorded and will eventually appear on our websites. And also, I want to thank Carla Ray, who is doing closed captioning for us today. So you should be able to enable live transcripts to watch that along. And also, of course, we want to acknowledge that the University of Iowa, and that's where I'm joining you virtually from, is located on the homelands of the Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Bahoche, Kickapoo, Menominee, Miamaki, Nutachi, Omaha, Osage, Jawari, Odawa, Ponca, Botawadmi Anishinaabe, Meskwaki, Nemahahaki, Sakawaki, Sac and Fox, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota Sioux, and the three affiliated tribes, Sanish, Nusbaga, Nuweta, and Ho-Chunk Winnebago nations. The tribal nations, the Omaha or Omaha tribe of Nebraska and Iowa, the Ponca or Ponca tribe of Nebraska, and the Meskwaki or Sac and Fox of the Mississippi and Iowa, and Ho-Chunk Winnebago tribe of Nebraska nations continue to live in this state of Iowa. We acknowledge their continuing existence and honor them as co-inhabitants of this land and the indigenous inhabitants. And also, since we're coming together via Zoom, Zoom has seemingly intangible as it is, has real tangible roots in the world, including large operating systems with ecological repercussions. And Zoom is headquartered on the lands of the Ohlone Tamian and Muwekma peoples, and its design includes copper wiring originally designed by Navajo women weavers. So thank you to the DNA for allowing us to join together today. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to University of Iowa MFA acting candidate Katie Guchik, who's bringing us together today, for Katie to introduce herself and then hand it to our illustrious panelists to introduce themselves.
Okay. Great. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jen. As she said, my name is Katie Guchik. I'm also Zooming in from Iowa City, Iowa. I have long brown hair that is in a braid at the side. I'm wearing a brightly colored orange and blue top and a blue and gold necklace. And I'm sitting in front of a green wall that also has a vibrant painting behind me that is various rainbow colors. Yes. So thank you all so much for joining me. This conversation is stemming from a project that is in the very early stages that I am working on at the University of Iowa. That is going to be centered around interviews that I do regarding sexual assaults and violence on campus at the University of Iowa. So I also just want to say this may be some heavy topics. So if you need to take a breath or take care of yourself, please do so throughout this. So yes, today we have two people here to talk to us about work that they have done with collective dramaturgy, and also they have some experience around using forum theater as a way to start a conversation around sexual assault and violence on campuses. So I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves, and then we will get started with the question and answer portion. So Jeffrey, do you want to, oh, and I'm sorry, I use she, her, hers pronouns. Great. So Jeffrey, do you want to hop on?
Certainly. Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you so much, Jen, for inviting me here today. My name is Jeffrey Pufall, he, him, and I'm zooming in from the University of Florida. And I have a pretty short haircut today that delightfully isn't showing all the gray, so it looks mostly brown, miraculously. And I'm wearing a blue and white striped shirt and sitting in my office, which is blurred out, and my home office, which is blurred out in the background. Go Gators. Yes, there you go, a little chomp for you all. So a little introduction about my work. My work is pretty varied and exploratory by nature. I'm a theater practitioner. I'm a director. I was an actor and singer professionally and director in the theater Canada regionally, and I've worked in the US and in the UK for 20 years before I made a shift into academia, into the Center for Arts and Medicine here at the University of Florida, which is an interdisciplinary unit housed in the College of the Art devoted to arts and health practice and investigation, education, research globally, locally. My work looks specifically at ways of how theater can generate critical dialogue around issues of community wellness and health. And so I generally partner with content experts in the field, and I am a forum expert with a very open and, I'm willing to explore almost any topic that deals with health and apply theater to it in some way. Although I find my personal research interests lie around issues of inclusion and connections around how feeling connected around us as a social determinant is a social determinant of health. And so I've done work with populations who with diagnoses or with OCD or other mental illnesses and theater. I have done a lot of work with the LGBTQIA plus community, both locally. I run programs here in Gainesville for teens and adults, as well as I've worked in India to develop a play designed to help audiences, heteronormative audiences, move towards a greater understanding and appreciation and solidarity towards LGBTQ populations. I recognize that I'm a white heterosexual male individual from a colonial who has benefited from colonial settlement of North America in my past. So I try to have an active role in anti-racist work and work around ensuring that all lives have equal value. I think in a nutshell, that looks at some of the, I've done work around race and health inequities in the US. A work of mine, From Colored to Black, explores this work deeply through the lens of oral history and community dialogue. I've done work around identity with students and reflecting on events such as the Women's March in 2017 and Trump inauguration and how that affected the student body. And, a lot more that I could talk about, but I won't take up much more time because I'd love to hear from my esteemed colleague, Amanda.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. And yes, we will get into more details soon. So Amanda.
I'm loving this like illustrious and esteemed language. That's just it really tickles me. So my name is Amanda Grace Ewing. I use she, her. I am a white woman with curly brown hair that's about shoulder length. I'm also wearing a cat eye glasses that has a sort of teal and gold accent on the upper rim. I'm wearing a blue-gray t-shirt with a marled gray and white sweater and a gold chain. And every once in a while, you're able to see my earrings, which are wooden and teal as well. I am a director, dramaturg. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion educator. And also recently, an intimacy choreographer. The thing for me that ties all of this work together is advocacy and service to community, which are two values that I hold deeply, along with playfulness and transparency, I think are really important. And as someone who does diversity, equity, and inclusion work, I think that playfulness and joy is a really vital part to this work being sustainable. For me, as a theater artist, theater is something that I use to help engage folks and make equity and inclusion work accessible for them. It's a catalyst for conversation. My career, my job at this moment is to be the director of the University of Michigan Educational Theater Company, which is an applied social justice theater company on the campus of the University of Michigan. It is a joint project between the Office of Student Life and the Office of Enrollment Management. I am not faculty, I am staff. I mentor students in the same way that an instructor might, but I am their boss. They are paid for rehearsals and performances. And the work that we do together is co-created by the company and me with insight from campus partners that we work very closely with. Part of being in student life offices means that we work really closely with the Sexual Assault Prevention and Awareness Center, with counseling and psychological services, and with some of our other affinity group offices. We create work that reflects our campus and the stories that we are telling, and it is constantly changing. Our work is required programming, which is something that makes us very unique in the realm of applied work on college campuses. We are a required part of orientation, where you see a show that is, again, co-created, that changes every year. That show is about transitioning to college and includes things about sexual misconduct prevention and awareness, about mental health, but also things like homesickness and finding community and belonging. We also do a workshop that on the second day of orientation about unconscious bias. Again, that's required. It's about unconscious bias in group work. And then students see us again as a part of another required program that is fulfilling some Title IX and state prevention work mandates. And that's a bystander intervention program that we do through the lens of identity. It's very much a forum theater piece that is filling some of these educational requirements that students have. We're part of a whole bunch of other partnerships as well that I can talk about with the counseling center, things that are not required. The majority of the work that we do is required. And then we have this small company that we piloted just 2.5 years ago that does consulting work within student life that is meant to strengthen existing diversity, equity, and inclusion peer education programs. So that is a little bit about me and the work that I do. And I'm really excited to have a conversation with y'all.
Okay, thank you so much. So I just want to clarify, when you say that it's required, so that's all students on campus have to come and see these,
Yeah, all undergraduate students at the
Wow.
University of Michigan are required to be a part of our programs and to attend them. So that is about 5,000 students for each show. So our orientation show, we perform 34 times over the course of 2 months. And which is the same for the unconscious bias workshop. And then our Change It Up bystander intervention workshop, which is a partnership with the First Year Experience. We do that one 110 times between October and November and have a company of 50 students who perform it. And again, are paid for rehearsals and performances. And I should also, the very important thing about this company is they are not all theater students. As theater students who are listening know, the requirements for a theater student to graduate from undergrad at a Big Ten program are strenuous and pretty detailed, right? So we might get theater students in their freshman or sophomore year before they are really getting to perform. But the majority of our students are coming from across campus who maybe did theater in high school and want to keep doing it. Michigan also has a community action and social change minor, and we see a lot of students who are doing that minor be a part of our program as well. And a lot of our students are also engineers. Big shout out to the engineers who want to be involved in arts and see the value of artistic thinking in engineering as well and in problem solving.
Great. That's amazing. Thank you, Amanda. So thank you both for, these wonderful introductions. I want to kick it back to Jeffrey. Your name was given to me specifically about the show Ashley's Consent that you worked on. So I would love it if you can give us some background on that, how it got started, and we'll kind of go from there, if that's all right.
Sure. Thank you for that. Ashley's Consent was born out of a desire from the Office of the Dean of Students to have a vehicle for education around issues of consent, bystander intervention, victim blaming, and also to provide students with some important information around resources that are available on campus. So a representative, a dean of students, came to the Center for Arts and Health and asked for this, if this could be a collaboration. I believe that dean at the time had done some work in Oregon, which has also a history of theater, effective use of theater for education. So that was the request to which I responded. I would be honored to take on this work and to develop a production that could try to attempt to address and bring students into a conversation around these important issues on campus. Mm-hmm. So it was a very much it was not an official program. I put up posters. I was in a visiting scholar line at that time at UF. And so I was not a part of the theater department. And so I didn't have a space to work with or any sort of formal structures around which that I could work. So it was very much a project that was also born out of the necessities of inspiration and finding a space and finding students who are interested in the work. So I did put up posters and a lot of word of mouth work to bring a team of students together. That's the background. I'm not sure how much you want of detail. Do you want me to go through the whole project at this point, or do you want me to?
I mean, I would love to hear about, yes, how you created this story. Was it based on interviews with the students? Was it? Yeah, I would love to hear about that process.
Okay. So we did take a really interesting approach. So I would say I'm a Brechtian. I'm looking at, although we did really take a narrative form, but I really wanted to use some theater of the oppressed techniques in this work and develop a relationship with an audience. So it's not a forum play per se. However, there is I wanted to integrate audience into the process. First, I partnered up with a graduate MFA student, Michael Martinez Hamilton, who was interested in the work and sort of working as a co-creator and writer. And we developed a scenario. I wanted to really explore the gray area. The spinal question, the essential question of the play that I developed was, what constitutes a sexual assault and when should I intervene? And so I wanted to get students together to explore the gray areas, to explore a nuanced scenario. And so first of all, Michael and I, and we had also, we were partnering with the Department of Victim Advocates and the Office of the Dean of Students, and with our on-campus health department, Gatorwell. So we had numerous stakeholders from the campus community and student health coming together to be on a kind of a board to discuss our goals and for me to be bouncing ideas off of. And so we came up with more or less an intricate scenario that, a skeleton of a story, essentially, of a student's journey, a female student's journey through a sexual assault. But was it a sexual assault? These were kind of the questions that we wanted to pose in the play. I wanted very much to develop a problem posing scenario, which for those of you who might be familiar with Boalian speak or applied theater in general, we try to pose problems instead of solutions with this type of theater, so that our audience members develop what's called an act hunger, or a desire to make change and to act on the action of the play and to suggest possible solutions and get into the conversation that way. So the students that I worked with, we brought a cast together. And that cast then were charged with improvising and doing their own research with colleagues and peers around their character's journey. So we had a protagonist who Ashley, who was assaulted at a party by her on again, off again boyfriend. And it was not a rape. We looked at a digital penetration scenario. And then her sort of the aftermath of that party, her experience then with her roommate, and how her roommate failed her, moving into a situation with her mother and how her mother failed her. And so it's a series of scenarios that ultimately, we don't exactly know what happened with Ashley. It ended up with a question mark of, she did go to the Office of the Dean of Students, and we filmed a lot of that interaction with actual student counselors and how they would handle it, so that we would model the process that students would go through. So students who watch the play would then begin to understand that process, to demystify it. to destigmatize it. And meanwhile, throughout all of these scenes, the cast was dialoguing. The cast was dialoguing as the cast, which sort of we thought was a functional Joker type figure, a mediator between the play world and the real world. And they posed questions to audience members in these inter-scene scenarios. And the play also happened outside in a breezeway type of space, which had a lot of different architecture. So can you imagine stairways and benches, and the audience could move through the space. And we were using little bits of technology and projection and these sorts of things to deal with Ashley when she had sort of disappeared and sort of dropped out of communication with a lot of people. We were able to still have her presence in a digital presence. So I took a very active site-specific approach to the piece to have audience moving through space, interacting close with actors and characters, almost integrated into the action, but still separate from the play world. So the students in their improvisations, they improvised the scenes over and over again. And Michael, our writer, we recorded those improvs and then eventually scripted the scenes. So the students' personal experiences were embedded into the script. Their dialogue was the show's dialogue was their dialogue, their improvisation, which was shaped through the rehearsal process and writing process with me and Michael, and then ultimately arriving at a formed and solid script that we performed. So in that way, the students had ownership. There was personal experience embedded into that. They did conduct their own discussions with their peers, as I said, to sort of integrate other knowledge and other experience into their work, but that was all done informally. So we performed the play many times over the course of a couple of years before my line kind of changed and I was sort of moved into a new area. And we partnered, of course, with victim advocates, with Gator ambassadors. It was open to the public. Students from all walks came, and we had a discussion post-show. And I also did a little bit of evaluative research on audience reactions and shifts in knowledge and perspectives in that work.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, hearing about this, I would love to discuss, because this is, heavy stuff. So did you have, and Amanda, you can speak on this as well, specific things in place for your actors, for your collaborators, and then also for your audience members, trigger warnings, or ways that to kind of protect people's mental health while dealing with these subjects? Any thoughts on?
I can jump in.
Or advice you can share on that?
So a lot of, the answer is yes, and in a lot of different ways.
Okay.
So and this has partially come out of my training as an intimacy choreographer, are really committed to having a consent-based practice, which in ETC means that I don't cast actors, they volunteer for roles. So the script might be something that we co-create, and then they tell me which roles they're willing to play. We, in our sexual misconduct work, don't do sort of like the long form that Jeffrey's talking about. We do shorter role plays with facilitated dialogue around them. So, and we'll do a lot of different kinds of scenarios. So I'll have them be like, yes, I can play this. No, I don't want to play this. And let me know like where those boundaries are for them. We also include de-rolling as part of our process, and also sometimes an intentional rolling, like rolling on of the part. So a de-rolling might be at the end of our process, instead of like a, I know I froze. So we use a format called that I learned from theatrical intimacy education that is, as an actor, or like as the character, I did blank. So like as the character, I attempted to take someone home from the party who was inebriated. As an actor, I delivered my lines, I executed my blocking. And then they have the option to add an additional, like what you would do in that scenario. If I were in that scenario, I would have intervened, found help, I would have reacted differently. So it's an option. It's not something that's required, but it is an offering that we make at the end of rehearsals and performances. And sometimes it really helps actors as well to sort of put the role on at the beginning and roll through this again at the beginning to say, like, I'm going to do this as my character. I'm going to do this as an actor. To help, yes, like Jeffrey's saying in the chat, help separate person from character. And our company is in large part folks who are experiencing, we do a lot of identity-based harm scenarios. And so these are scenarios that people are also experiencing in their real lives, not just on stage regularly. So we've been looking for ways to be more trauma informed in the work that we do. And this is one of the things that we do. The opting in is one of the things that we do. And we also give people, I often will write like 10 scenarios when we're only going to use 3 so that we can really choose and hold our boundaries and really respect those day to day. Because what might work for you and your boundaries the day before might not work today. Maybe you have a bad workshop and something's really triggering or activating. And at the next workshop, you just don't want to do that scene again. And so we try to have a lot of options so that students can and performers can adapt to that.
Gotcha. Thank you. So it sounds like in that scenario, Amanda, you're writing these scenarios. But have you ever worked on interview based and doing verbatim theater? And was that, and also Jeffrey, was there any component of that in Ashley's consent? And I just am really curious about, right, the ethics of interviewing and the ethics of then sharing these stories. Yeah, so if either of you have any thoughts on that.
I do focus groups. I don't do verbatim. And because we're doing the same workshops over and over again over years and years, I visit all of our schools and colleges and do focus groups with all of them every maybe 2 or 3 years to try to make sure that I'm still sort of on the pulse of it. And then also I meet with campus partners who are hearing more regularly from a larger section of this campus to make sure that things are still reflective of our environment. And then I would also just like throw in that there's this really fascinating study that came out. It's a book called Sexual Citizens. I know Jen is all over the chat dramaturgy. It's sexualcitizens.com. And it's an ethnographic study of students in New York colleges by Jennifer Hirsch and Seamus Khan that both I and a lot of my partners use. It being ethnographic, it has a lot of interviews in it, a lot of student voice in it. And it suggests actually some of the things I was hearing Jeffrey talk about, that their sexual misconduct sort of happens in the intersection of these 3 different perspectives. That we have sexual projects, which is that students come to college with a sexual project in mind, and that could be growing experience, it could be finding your partner, it could be maybe coming out. Like those are some projects that students come to college with. That students all have sexual citizenship, which is the right to say yes and the right to say no. That's not something that we know, but something that we have to be taught and develop. And that there are sexual geographies, that the spaces and places that we move through are essential to how we interact, that college campuses have specific geographies. If you've asked your roommate to leave so that you can bring somebody home, there is an additional geography to that interaction. And so these intersections and the ways that we don't communicate them are part of where misconduct happens, when our projects don't line up, when our geographies, like if you have to take a cab to get to a party and can't afford to take a cab home, like that's staying overnight somewhere until the buses or subway starts running. That's a geography that when these things don't line up is where sexual misconduct can happen. And what defines what Jeffrey's talking about is that gray zone, where like we don't know what to call it, or people who are professionals in sexual misconduct prevention and advocacy might legally call it assault, misconduct, right? But that we as the people who experience it might not self-identify with those same definitions. So I and my campus partners have leaned really heavily on that as well when looking at building scripts and scenarios.
Yeah, I'm like, this is why Amanda is my favorite human in this business, because it's a mix of lived experience and the data, the literature, the psychology involved in this. It's really important to have a multiple pronged approach when doing this work, and leaning into what is known and what is understood with the lived experiences of individuals. So your question around stories, and I mean, my feeling is stories are and personal accounts are really useful to this field. However, I'm a really strong believer in positive psychology around this. I think the field sort of delved into stories of trauma and stories of victimhood, and maybe came out with some understanding that it may not be the best approach. Like, we do not really need to go to theater to see victim stories of women being victimized to develop an empathy for those women. I don't think that is a really strong approach to take, right? Which is that whole question of, should we take a victim stories and stage it and put it on stage? What is the value of that? And I think investigating that and asking, what do we really want to accomplish by that is a big question. And an ethical question is what we decide to stage as theater makers. Where I think that we actually have more benefit is working around different psychologies and stories of resilience, and different perspectives around these psychologies. And I think that we need to look at also who is our audience. I don't think we need to be making these plays for young women only, when we all know that it's young men who really need to be seeing these. And that's not to erase same-sex abuse and misconduct at all, but to get into what I tweak on immediately when I hear Amanda talk is, yes, let's talk about those sexual projects. Let's get into the stories of young men and their desire for, and young women for their desires for sexual projects, and those kinds of stories are powerful, right? Of what students want, what students are thinking, what's happening, what are they thinking about? Those are the conversations that I think we should be getting into, and not the end result of sexual misconduct and hoping that by seeing it, men will sort of be guilted into feeling some empathy towards women, because I don't really think that is a motivator of behavior change, to be honest.
Yeah.
One of the things they say, like really early in that book, is that like when you go to driver's ed, they don't teach you how the engine works. They teach you the rules of the road and how to be in conversation with the cars around you. But for some reason, when you go to sex ed, they teach you how the engine works, and not how to learn the rules of the road and the dialogue and like how to talk about sex. which I think is a really interesting part of all of this. Is like, it's very much, it's a sex ed, and the failures of sex ed in the US system are obviously a part of this ongoing problem.
That's right, because students arrive on campus and they have not learned anything. And what they've learned is from pornography and from each other. And they've been taught in a lot of states, sexual education is not science-based at all. They can be taught, there's no mandating of what they are taught in the classroom.
Yeah, and we can see it in our acting classrooms as well, with how we do and do not learn how to articulate boundaries, being hard to work with, sort of the replaceability of people is something that we in the capitalist society are constantly reminded that we are replaceable cogs in this machine, that isn't trauma informed. So this question of like trigger warnings and consent and ethics of interviewing is about being trauma informed, and I really bump up against the theatrical notion of like, theater's here to make you feel. Mm-hmm. Well, life is here to make you feel, right? People have plenty of opportunities to develop resiliency. Like, that is not our job, right? We need to trust our audiences that they know themselves better than we do. And this sort of elitism around like, we have something to teach you with our theater is not trauma informed either. Mm. We need to be consent based in our practice and how we build this, but also in like how we engage the audiences that we bring in. Like, they get to have consent and boundaries too.
Can both of you speak on that? Because Jeffrey, you had mentioned that you had then community conversations after Ashley's consent. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with how you engaged an audience after the show?
Yeah, we actually had the cast. The cast leads the conversation, because part of the work, and I know that this is a cornerstone of Amanda's program as well, is that the students become the advocates through the process of entering into the theater process. They do so much learning in order to deliver the material and to deepen into the content, and they're having the programmatic discussions with victim advocates, with the dean of students, with other students and professors, that they become the experts. And so with faculty and non-faculty staff and victim advocate support, they are well equipped to lead a conversation with audience about their experience of the play, to answer any questions about the characters, right? Because they are the experts on the characters. And then when questions become, maybe systems-based questions around the university, then those people are there on hand to help answer those questions about processes of reporting, or what resources are there for students. Or maybe if students, we had a lot of discussions around sort of responsibility, and even because we explored this kind of tricky situation around fault and criminal prosecution versus not prosecuted, how does the school handle it? Every school has its own process for handling sexual assaults. And so students are very interested in that. Actually, they want to know how things work, because generally you arrive and you don't have an understanding of how things work at all, especially on a big R1 campus like we are all at, right? You jump in with thousands of students and you have no sense of what is available to you. So at that time, we did a lot of our conversation around resources. We really wanted students to understand what was available to them, who was there for them, what do they have to do as a victim advocate, as a bystander, as a friend, as somebody who has experienced sexual misconduct. I think giving them those tools really became really a priority for us, and developing that understanding afterwards in the discussion, so that students really left with that, and a sense of that was key.
Great, thank you. And Amanda, do you do any follow-up with, I mean, I know, so you said 5,000 students a year come and see your work. So are you able to engage afterwards? Is there some sort of form that you fill out, or are there public conversations with those students?
Yeah, so yes, with the undergraduate students, because we're a part of Student Life has a sort of like a standard evaluation that they send out after all of your Student Life programming. One of the things that is the benefit of that is then over 4 years, you can track a student's growth and development. We are not working in isolation. I'm a theater person that like works with a lot of social workers and higher ed professionals. And so scaffolding is this, like they use this word scaffolding all the time to think about like how we are dosing out education across 4 years of a student's experience at school. So like the work that I do in orientation is very much more awareness. The work that we do in your first semester is more about your own identity development. Then you continue to work through your classes, through your res life, through all of these different avenues for like how you will continue to develop. So I am very much in the first step with students. I do also work newly with graduate students. As a graduate student yourself, and with some graduate students listening to us, graduate students are a just hugely underserved population in sexual misconduct work. You have a very strange power positionality where sometimes you are teachers, sometimes you are students, where professors can hold the keys to your
Oh no.
Come on.
Oh.
Come on, man.
Ooh, you're back.
I'm back. Am I back?
Back.
Okay, good. Well, let's just hope that nothing I said while I was frozen got through. So anyway, graduate professors can hold the like keys to your future, right? So I have worked in partnership with the Sexual Assault Prevention and Awareness Center. We call it SAPAC. And also with our Office of Student Conflict Resolution to create these, it's called Engaging Respectful Communities. And they are working with graduate students in this like circle process. So circles are a restorative justice practice. Circles are obviously used in tons of storytelling ways and storytelling development. They're an Indigenous practice. And we lead peer-led circles where you'll hear a monologue and then have the opportunity to do a circle to react to how you might intervene, what resources do you need to know about, what's your responsibility and role and connection to this. And it often has become an ongoing conversation with the Sexual Assault Prevention Awareness Center on the culture of that unit and how to better define the graduate students' positions. Sometimes as a graduate student, you are an individual with reporting obligations, which is what we at University of Michigan call a mandatory reporter. So sometimes you're an individual with reporting obligations, sometimes you're not. How do you tell? Like, how do you know when you're talking to your friends in your lab and they're disclosing something to you? Do you have an obligation to report that or not? Right. So we talk a lot about roles and continuing that conversation in that environment. And we're also part of impact training, which is like for sports, athletics, fraternity and sorority life, the mandatory training that they have to get that's anti-sexual harassment and hazing. And that is also like a continuing conversation with resources on campus that run that.
This is maybe a little bit off topic, but I'm just curious if there have been tracking or studies that when this program started at University of Michigan, and has it had a positive effect? Have the numbers gone down of people? I mean, how it's so hard because it just depends on, some people may not report. But I'm just wondering if there's any info on that.
So nationally, sexual misconduct reporting numbers have remained steady since colleges allowed women to attend. All of the education that we have been doing, the numbers have remained the same. As someone who pointed out in the, I haven't read the whole thing. I promise I'm coming back to this question that's in the Q&A, but the statistic that's often used with this, like 1 out of 5 women are going to be assaulted in their undergraduate career. That number is 1 out of 5 white women. It is not at all reflective of our full campus. We know that those numbers are higher for trans students. We know that those numbers are higher for students of color. We know that those numbers are higher for students with disabilities. And so that's an important part of how we're tracking progress and change, is also like including everyone in how we're doing data collection. As far as like the existence of this program, the Educational Theater Company has existed for 25 years at the University of Michigan. I am its 3rd director. We also have 2 other applied theater programs at U of M. So my scope is to work with undergraduates. Sometimes me, just as Amanda, works with graduate students, but my company works with undergrads. We have the CRLT players, who run almost exactly the same as us, but they serve teaching graduate students and faculty. And they have a really fantastic program called Moving the Needle, which is about exactly what you're talking about, moving the needle on sexual misconduct prevention. And they've been performing that program for, I think, 3 years now. And they've got it as where like they have a multi-day leadership academy, and then also different programming for everybody else. But we know that in order to make actual culture change, that an investment and change has to come from leadership. And then we also have a Prison Creatives Arts Project that works with Washtenaw County and Michigan prisons on doing applied theater in prisons. So we have an institutional investment in applied theater as a teaching tool that has existed even before the 25 years of this program. This program used to be called ResRep, and every residence hall had its own repertory theater company doing applied pieces about transition to college and living in a residence hall. And then, housing was like, we don't know how to run theater companies, which is fair. Like they got a lot to do in housing. And so they sort of passed it to someone else. But we know that it's an effective peer-to-peer education tool, but students graduate and the institution stays. Mm-hmm. So how do you change the institution and the structure that we exist in, especially in a predominantly white institution?
Jen, I see you've joined us back.
Yes,
Are
I
you
have.
to ask this question that's been posted?
Yes. So I'm so appreciating so much of this, and I'm really glad, Amanda, that you brought up the issue of grad students and the kind of unusual, or not unusual, but different power situation. And there I think that highlights two things I want to get into, but the one of them is about policy and how we talk about policy, which you all have brought up. But another one is coming from the Q&A. I think is really important to highlight with this combination of like data and lived experience. This speaks to also, which is. How to approach the question is how do we approach sexual assault discussions in a way that are applicable and accessible to the majority of students without erasing queer students and or creating a kind of gender essentialist narrative of men assault women. On the one hand, that is a statistically backed generalization, but on the other hand, failure to intersect with queer identities can also cause harm. So how do we balance the clarity of the message and the accessibility for the majority of students with all of these intersections of identity, many of which Amanda just brought up? That's a hard question, but what are you doing in your work to balance those things?
I can tell you how we're trying, and I can't tell you how if we're succeeding. But how we are trying is, like I said earlier, like we write scenarios and students opt into casting them, which means sometimes, depending on who performs them, we're depicting harm that is, we're predicting harm or talking about harm between straight couples, and sometimes we're talking about harm between queer couples, and sometimes we're having cis students perform roles, and sometimes we're having trans students perform roles. We've noticed that it is some ways that we have cast this, we're still sort of piloting around what casting looks like here, which is why I do not have a clean answer for this question, is that sometimes it is really difficult for straight students to notice the harm. And that in itself can be harmful to the queer performers who are not, whose peers are not noticing the ways in which they're being harmed in your communities. And so then we have a little question, a messy grossness around the necessary education in our community, and it being something that our performers can perform in ways that are within their boundaries and that are affirming of the identities that they hold. So that is my messy answer to not having a clear cut way, but it's absolutely a valuable thing that we continue to return to, especially because we know that the numbers are higher, especially for trans students on campus.
Great, thank you for answering that. I guess what I'd like to ask now is, throughout, and Jeffrey, if you want to talk specifically about Ashley's consent, or if you want to talk about other work, what were things you learned during that process? So if you want to talk about successes first, or maybe things that you would do differently.
Well, some of the analysis that I conducted around the piece, were really clear. So we learned that, I just was grabbing that screen here. We learned a lot from the play itself. and student reactions to the play. We really noted that there was a large increase in confidence around feeling that students could do something, that sense of agency, developing a sense of agency around bystander intervention, I think is a strength for this kind of work. I think presenting scenarios around which students can dialogue of things and develop strategies and discuss strategies of ways of preventing, ways of reacting to, ways of spotting issues amongst their peers is a strength for the work. As well, we really found that a majority of the students, all of these numbers I'm talking about are 80% and above of students felt that the play helped them understand what consent was, what affirmative consent actually was, which is, coming back to Amanda's earlier comment around the rules of the road. Let's talk about how to drive cars, not what do you do with a broken or a smashed up car. 80% help them understand what victim blaming was, what it looks like, right? I think when you model some victim blaming to students and give them the chance to say, okay, there's the problem there, and to bring out the problem and to discuss the problem is also very beneficial for the work to do. And as well, we had a lot of success around understanding what the reporting process is. So students feel like they came away from the work knowing what they could do and how to do it. And I think those were the outcomes that I highlight in the work that I did with Ashley's Consent. Mm-hmm. Other stuff that I looked at too was around the theater itself. Students were really engaged through the site-specific format. They liked the enhancement of technology, and they found, they like being actively involved in the theater, that process. And I think not just our play, which was moving around space, but what Amanda's talking about with story circles and scenarios involved in the center, and students can participate in conversation with each other in enclosed space is a very active method of having conversations. But in other work that I've done, I'm looking at the mechanisms, for example, in my play Ashley's Consent that I made with Brittany Caldwell. Students do respond to data. Students do respond to facts, and they're interested in those things. They're interested in ways that we as makers can interlay and juxtapose information in new ways for them. Right, because we know that the students in general, they're not picking up brochures and reading them deeply and absorbing and retaining those kinds of informations. But when they're seeing them interplaced with lived experiences that reaffirm these sorts of statistics or numbers in campus, then the numbers begin to have meaning, and we begin to experience these in a new and visceral way. So I think those are some learnings that I'm still developing, right? Where I think I had done some work, and it's, theater needs to be emotion, right? Theater, the power is the emotion. But if I'm not balancing that with some didactic, with some hardcore information, because we crave facts. There's a sort of like part of verbatim theater's power, right, is that it's truth. It's somebody's lived experience and it's truth. And so you as an audience member receive that story differently when you know it is spoken from the first person. And then when that is backed up with some other information to contextualize it, there's something else that's going on cognitively with audience members that is really powerful. And I think that's what can be a driver of behavioral change, which is ultimately what we're after here.
Yeah, thank you. Amanda, do you have any follow-up to that?
I was listening to Jeffrey talk, and I can't remember what your question was. I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What was the question, Katie?
Well, so with the work that you do, things that you've learned, things that maybe didn't work in the beginning, successes?
Yeah, we've learned a lot about casting, like I was just talking about. We have learned also a lot about this peer education piece. When we first started, I was having our undergraduate company perform for the graduate students, for example, in those story circles. And having the monologues performed by graduate students makes a big difference. This sort of peer-to-peer part is important. And is also true in our undergraduate workshops. I've also learned that because there's a couple things. The mandatoriness of the work that we do is both like exciting and really challenging. Especially when you start to like grapple with how to be trauma informed. We've shifted a lot of these of the identity-based scenarios, the identity-based harm that we show, out of our mandatory workshops. Because of how it forces sort of our most marginalized students to have to watch their like white peers sort of grapple with identity out loud, grapple with not noticing things. A thing that happens in some of our undergraduate workshops is that like white students might say for the first time that they're white, and then try to sort of we ask a question about like, how does your identity impact what you notice is harmful? And so they might notice for the first time out loud that they're white, and then also come to the conclusion that that means that they haven't been noticing harm outside of their experience, sort of out loud. Maybe earlier in the workshop, they said something was harmful while they were sort of processing out loud too. And like all of that sort of crashes on each other at once. So we've been doing a lot of shifting of how we use story, how we use sort of the fantastic to experiment. So thanks to the pandemic, we moved this workshop online and created an animated course that it was completely animated. Your like facilitator was like a little robot that talked. It was also all animated by students, just like incredible work by undergrads. And you had like the values had characters. So you had like True and Sue, who were like these trust and support, who were these little characters. You had Autonomy was like a dinosaur with multiple heads, right? So we looked at like, how are we using story to be more accessible and trauma informed, and then doing some of this more identity-based work in ways that we could control. So in the Engendering Respectful Communities workshop, students know what the workshop is about. They get an outline of the questions that we're going to talk about. They get support. We have someone from SAPAC at every workshop. When we first started piloting them, we also had someone from our Title IX office at every workshop, so that we were better able to support students there. We also learned that when we do those workshops, it's important to know what the culture of that unit is. I had some really terrible learning moments where a monologue that I had written which I wrote from focus groups and from all this research we've been talking about, was pretty close to harm that had happened in that department pretty recently. And learned that after we had performed that monologue. And so really sense of urgency is a characteristic of white supremacy culture. Slowing down, disinvesting from white supremacy culture and slowing down to get to know the places that you're going, their needs and their experiences before bringing this work, and constantly checking in to see how we're doing that, and recognizing how we've screwed it up too. Are a lot of things that we've learned.
Right.
I'll add a little bit to that. These theater forums also provide the space for our actors, and this is a hallmark of the work that I like to make, is that the actors on stage are having the difficult conversations for and with our audience members, and that having multiple and opposing viewpoints on stage, and deconstructing those and deepening into understanding those is an important part of this work. So that involves exploring mindsets of what we believe to be perpetrators, and taking apart those mindsets in a respectful way, looking at them without demonizing those individuals, so that internal work in audience members can occur. Because when we see those belief systems that we may hold on stage, and we might be silently holding those, might have a sexual conquest or two on one's mind, and we start to learn what's at root in that psychology through conversations that we're seeing actors on stage happen, and dismantling of it, our internal work. And this is the work what sociodrama and forum theater is doing, right? It's having that work, that conversation internally, so that we know that those mindsets, when people go away, they continue to ruminate, right? When they see the work on stage, as in the parlance of transformative learning theory, is what's called a disorienting dilemma. So we see the disorienting dilemma, which flies in the face of what we believe, and then we see a bunch of discussion around it with people who want to have that discussion. And I'm sort of like, okay, there's my point of view represented up there, and then I can see it taken apart. I'm more likely then for my viewpoints to change. So I believe in having that dialogue on stage as well, have the actors help the audience have those conversations by just modeling them.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. Something that I'm having this conversation and interviewing other people because something that I'm grappling with is something that Jeffrey, you had mentioned earlier, but whether or not I should even be making this piece, because I have this desire to do verbatim theater. But whether or not that is the right avenue for creating a piece around sexual assault on campus. But what I keep also coming back to is I want to interview victims and offenders, because I think what I struggle with this, because I don't want it to be a piece about, I don't want to uplift bad behavior. So I don't want it to make it about that. I also don't want to do something that's shocking for shock value. But what I'm interested in is the humanity in people. And if I can somehow humanize both sides of these really tricky situations. And so I guess what I would love is your opinions on whether that style of doing a verbatim theater piece around this, do you think it can be beneficial? And do you think it can be helpful? And I would like your honest opinion. I'm sure you will be honest, but.
Yeah, do you want me to jump in, Amanda, or you want to jump in?
Yeah, you jump in. I'm still trying to think about what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, because I think a lot of us think a lot about this, and so I think I've mentioned it, but and I think and I'm also piggybacking on what Amanda's saying here too. What I feel is that there's so much to explore before the actual event, the sexual misconduct, the thing happens and the aftermath happens. There's so much to explore before that that is worthy of theater. If you're following me, and to get into the minds of everything that happened up until the rape itself, or whatever it is that occurs, rather than exploring and deepening into the aftermath of the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we want to, how we can affect our students and behavior changes every moment up until that moment. And I think that's where I think there needs to be a shift in our approach, right? Because I think that we've seen a lot of victim theater and heard stories of assault and the aftermath.
Mm-hmm.
And what Amanda's telling us and what I'm really hearing is that isn't working. Yeah. And so I don't think, and I think some of that is important, right? We need to have some of it, but I think can be indulgent to enter into stories of victimization and to paint victims as victims and hold those stories up as the piece, when really what is the behavior that we need to address is everything that happens up until that moment.
Right.
My projects, my sexual conquests, the night of the party, what happened, what are all those given circumstances, and where can we start to dismantle that behavior so the misconduct itself doesn't occur. It's preventative medicine, I think, is what I'm trying to get at. We don't want to be treating the symptoms. We don't want to be coming in. We're not the emergency room physicians. We're not counselors and victim advocates. So it's kind of not our job as theater makers to be doing that work. It's our job as theater makers to be, pulling apart the play that happens before those events and looking at behaviors and the whys and the where can we think, how can we think differently? How can we name those behaviors, right? I just jump right into what's happening in the literature in the sexualcitizens.com, and I'm looking at all those names and I'm like, oh, that is just the most useful stuff. If we can name the behaviors, and so that if I know I'm exhibiting those behaviors in my life, and then I can name them and I can understand the harm that they lead to, I'm more apt to change that behavior.
Great. Thank
you. Yeah, I mean, okay, here's what I'm thinking through, Katie. I'm thinking about, like, obviously survivor stories have value, right? And hearing from survivors is absolutely valuable, especially if it's, affirming and uplifting of community. If it's, as somebody who's seeking to, like, always be building community through theater, but I'm obviously, like, sort of zoned in on, like, how will it build community? But I'm also thinking about, like, how does restorative justice play into that? So restorative justice asks who's been hurt, what do they need, and who has an obligation to address those needs and to put right harm. So, like, what does accountability look like? So my question back to your question is, like, I have a practices research background, like a performance studies practices research background as well. So I'm like, what's your research question? Like, what is it seeking to hold someone accountable? Is it seeking to build community? Is it seeking to do restorative justice? What verbatim theater for what? Which is the same thing that I think about, like, as a facilitator, a theater maker, when we talk about what's trauma informed. One of the things that I think that we have great strength as is that as theater practitioners, we're always asking, well, what does that do? What does it look like? What is it in action? So my question back to whether or not to do a verbatim piece is, what does it do? How does it make social change? And if you can do that, by other means is like, should you?
Right.
Yeah. And then there's like all sorts of ethics around like who owns the story. Like if somebody decides later that they don't want those words in that verbatim piece anymore, how do you respond to their boundaries, which they have a right to like change and move? And how do you hold a piece in time in that way?
Right.
Are my questions back to your question?
That's great. And it gives me a lot to think about.
Yeah, and as Jeffrey's saying in the chat, who is the audience? I think these questions of what is the research question? What is the purpose? Who is the audience? What is the relationship of the performer to the audience? What is the relationship of the piece to the existing culture that you're speaking into? Yeah, what is the function of the piece? I have so many questions, but I want to be really mindful that we're nearing the end of our allotted time, and I want to be mindful of your esteemed and illustrious and valuable time. But maybe I can funnel my
Put a few questions in there, Jen.
Yeah. What's that?
Get them in there. Let's hear them.
Get them in there. Okay. So maybe I can funnel my questions back to a bit of background storytelling, which is that when Katie first brought this idea to Borderless, it was, as I recall, Katie, correct me if I'm wrong, but in conversation with another MFA actor, Olivia Foster, saying, we get so many emails about assault on campus that I forget the exact wording, it's changed over the years, but this is a mandatory, reported, et cetera, and they come in just in waves. And I know, because of working with previous students and trying to understand university structures, that the way that they are reported to us has to do with the Clery Act and with, past policies that are based on past laws and past actions. And university, some of the things are Big Ten specific and some of them are not. Some of them are apply to all higher educational institutions. I'm just really struck by the idea that not only understanding resources, which of course makes great sense if you want to make a piece that is useful, but the idea of understanding university structures has come up in this conversation. That students and teachers and other university audiences want to know, why do we get these emails? And that suggests to me another approach to this storytelling, to be braided in with survivor stories or to be braided in with bystander imaginaries, but just what does it mean to be a mandatory reporter? Who's a mandatory reporter? Why do things get reported the way that they are? How do those structures affect the way that we understand the data? All of that leads me to a question that I have is, what are your mechanics of doing research? You both have mentioned doing interviews and talking to various different university structures, having students talk to people. Are the students also doing and sharing like written research? And I'm going to throw in one more question and you can just answer whatever you want of it. What recommendations do you have for those of us who are interested in this topic of sexual assaults on campus and the topic of applied theater? What should we be reading? What should we be reading and watching and educating ourselves with? There you go. 50 questions to answer in 3 minutes.
I'm like, I remember the most recent one.
That's okay.
You asked, who do we talk to? Like, something about structures.
What research are your participants, your makers doing, and how are they sharing
Oh,
it in the group? And what research should we be doing?
yeah. So for me, my students are, I think that part of what our company does is teach our students skills around community organizing. And I think that a lot of what this work is teaching these transferable skills around community organizing. A lot of our students end up going and being leaders in different affinity groups, advocacy groups on campus. There are things that are not possible to do from our positionality in the structure of the university. They are employees of the university, and so they can take the skills that they learn from us elsewhere and organize elsewhere. But there are some things that, like if you want to advocate for a change in the policy, like that's not something you do from inside our company. That's something you can take these skills and do from outside. Because our positionality is to reflect what exists at the university and what resources currently exist. So most of the research that my students are doing is just so ridiculous. Living, like just being a student on campus is their research. The things that they're experiencing day to day, the ways that they're learning how to navigate campus. There was this really interesting guide that came out that was student created that we ended up like putting in some of our orientation programming and in the orientation program in general. It was called the Being Not Rich at Michigan guide. And it was this open Google Doc of students just like trying to figure out how to not be affluent at the University of Michigan and where to get access and resources. And it was an open source thing. So that isn't, I would think of it as like reading and learning about the community. And for me, that's research, but for them, that is being a student and navigating the environment at Michigan. I obviously think that the Sexual Citizens book is a must read for everyone. And I have also found training with theatrical intimacy education really influential on how I think about being trauma informed and advocacy and consent-based practice in the work that we do. So that's what I would say. I would also say there's this like really bananas book that came out, just bananas from my positionality, incredibly researched book called Undermining Racial Justice. And it's a history of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at the University of Michigan. And the author spent years in our historic library researching the institution, the ways that the institution has adapted to uphold white supremacy. It's got correspondence from university presidents, leaders in it. And actually my colleagues over at the CRLT Players have created a piece about it to talk about anti-Blackness in the institution. And while it's specific to U of M, it is widely the story of institutions our size across the nation. And so it's something that, while not directly sexual misconduct work, prevention work, and equity and anti-racism work need to be integrated, need to be thought of as one path. These things don't happen separately from each other. Diversity, equity, and inclusion work is not like a pool that sits over there that like sometimes we engage with. It is a part and underpinning of all of our work. And so I would say that engaging with books like that, with anti-racism resources, is an important way to understand the full scope of sexual misconduct that doesn't center the experiences of white women, which is how we've been socialized to understand sexual misconduct and who it happens to and who the survivors are.
Whew. And Jeffrey dropped in the chat Title IX reporting processes, available support systems, difficult conversations training. Yeah.
Yeah, I found it useful that in our group, all the students did that research, and they didn't have a understanding of Title IX, and for them to go and do that research, bring it back, share it with the group. Similarly, go talk to people in the victims advocates office or care team or dean of students office, and get that knowledge of how things work firsthand, and bring that into the group, and then integrating it into the play. It's important that students are doing the research and creating the scripts, and ownership of the work and co-ownership of the work is essential here. And it all comes back to, we go to the theater to learn how to be human. We go to the theater to learn how to get along with each other, right? The theater is a model for how we are in the world. And, Anne Bogart makes that so clearly in, I don't know if you've ever watched her talk on the vital and energetic role of the audience. Jen's nodding.
Yeah.
And I think that's really where my heart lies in this work, is create work where we can learn how to be in community with each other. Yeah, just to echo again what Amanda's saying.
Well, this has been really amazing. Thank you all for the homework. Thank you, Katie, for bringing us together. And I definitely look forward to see where your process is going to go. And thank you, Jeff and Amanda, for being with us and sharing your illustrious and esteemed expertise and experience. Katie, is there
humble expertise, humble experience.
Indeed, because it's no matter how you approach the work, you're going to learn in the process, and I think making mistakes is part of it. And it's a difficult terrain to enter into, and you also have to take care of yourself in the process as makers. And note that secondary trauma is a thing. You'll be here if you're hearing stories that they can cause you, also harm. And so to take care of yourself, and then, how do you take care of yourself? How do you take care of your company? How do you take care of those of the students who you're working with, who are sharing their stories and their experiences? I think that's something that we have to keep in mind always, so that we're taking care of each other through these processes. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, great. Amanda just shared her email in the chat. Thank you very much.
Yes. Katie, is there anything you would like to say to close this out?
Just thank you for sharing your experiences and opinions and advice. And I have a lot to think about moving forward. And I just so appreciate you taking out some time on this Friday morning before the weekend to join us. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all. And thank you to those who attended. And thanks to those who are watching later. And I'm sure this conversation will continue.
Yes.
Thanks.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.